ha-Kelim. The mystery of Sha'ar ha-Kelim opens when one contemplates the transition from Adam-Kadmon, that primordial configuration in which the infinite radiance has already been traced into outline, to the very first attempt at articulation through the Sefirot, for in the ha-Kelim all 10 lights are still bound together in a single vessel. Thus compressed and inseparable, an image at once of perfect unity and of unbearable tension, for multiplicity cannot remain forever concealed within one narrow channel, and yet the light cannot yet expand into full differentiation without shattering the very vessels that seek to contain it, and so the ha-Kelim stage is both the seed of all unfolding and the foreshadowing of all catastrophe, the knot that must be tied before it can ever be undone. The very name ha-Kelim, drawn from the Torah's description of Jacob's sheep, the ha-Kelim marked with bands, or bindings, Genesis chapter 30 verse 39, encodes this reality, just as the sheep wore bands across their limbs, signifying unity and restraint within adversity, so too the primordial lights were banded together, bound within one vessel, 10 forces indistinguishable yet struggling for expression. In the teaching of the Ari is transmitted by Ayam vital in the Etz Ayam, the stage arises when the light issues from the eyes of Adam-Kadmon, descending not yet as separate emanations but as one stream in which all 10 Sefirot are interwoven, and thus they are said to be ha-Kelim, tied together like pearls on a single thread. But this is no gentle harmony, it is a paradox, for the lights remain infinite, expansive, each demanding its own vessel, yet they are compressed into unity, creating a state of extreme pressure, and it is precisely this compression that sets the stage for the drama of the Shevirat ha-Kelim, the breaking of the vessels, which later unfolds in the world of Tohu. Thus, to contemplate ha-Kelim is to enter the threshold of the great mystery of differentiation, to feel the tremor of multiplicity bound within unity, to sense the primordial pulse of creation before it bursts forth into fragment and repair. When a contemplative seeks to align with the state of ha-Kelim, he must understand that this is not yet the world of balance or of rectification, but the seat of tension in which all opposites are compressed into oneness, like breath held in the chest, like thought unspoken, like fire bound within coal before it bursts into flame. The practice is to enter into silence, to draw all faculties inward, to restrain differentiation, to bind sight, hearing, breath, and speech into a single point of concentration, for as the lights were bound into one vessel, so must the inner powers of the soul be gathered into unity before they can expand into service. In practical terms, the adept sits in stillness and imagines each of the 10 Sefirot, crown, wisdom, understanding, kindness, strength, beauty, eternity, splendor, foundation, and sovereignty as sparks within himself, yet instead of envisioning them unfolding into their proper channels, he gathers them all into a single point of light in the center of his heart, contracting multiplicity into unity, breathing slowly so that even the rhythm of life itself seems restrained. He contemplates the divine light as a column pressing downward into him, all attributes bound together, a pressure almost too much to contain, and he sustains the awareness that this very compression is the essence of ha-Kelim, the binding of forces before their release. The Zohar speaks of the flame bound to the coal, the light that cannot yet separate from its source, and so too the adept visualizes his thoughts, emotions, and desires not as scattered and wandering, but tied together. One knot of consciousness, one unified vessel holding the 10,000 impulses that ordinarily pull the soul apart. It is said that in the ha-Kelim there was only one vessel for all 10 lights, and thus the practice may also be expressed in the body. The meditator considers his body itself as that single vessel, and all faculties, mind, heart, will, action, as the lights bound within. This induces a state of tremendous inner concentration, where the many streams of thought are restrained from scattering, gathered into one awareness. And this is not merely a psychological exercise but a theurgical imitation of the primordial stage of emanation, for in binding the self, one mirrors the binding of the Sefirot in ha-Kelim. Yet one must also sense the danger latent in the state, for just as the vessels could not long contain the expansive light and broke, so too the soul may feel strain when holding multiplicity within one vessel. And here, the practice becomes delicate, to sustain the tension without rupture, to cultivate awareness of the pressure without dissipating into distraction. The adept is invited to linger in that edge between silence and overflow, feeling how unity presses toward multiplicity, how the bound lights yearn to differentiate, yet remain, for a time, compressed. From this contemplation arises an awareness of the necessity of limitation, for in the ha-Kelim the infinite does not yet step forth into measured channels, and so all is bound and indistinguishable. The practice here is not to leap too quickly into expression but to remain with the unexpressed, to taste the silence that precedes the word. In daily ritual this may be enacted by entering prayer not with a rush of words but with a long inward pause, gathering all intentions, all yearnings, all thoughts into a single knot of silence before letting them flow into speech. The ha-Kelim stage thus teaches the sanctity of restraint, the holiness of that which is not yet manifest, the power of binding before release. It is a training in inner unification, where the multiplicity of desires and faculties within the human being is tied together, teaching the soul to become like that single vessel which once held the tenfold light. On a cosmic level, the ha-Kelim represent the impossibility of sustaining undifferentiated multiplicity within one channel, and so they are the foreshadowing of Shevirat, the breaking. On the human level, the practice of ha-Kelim is the training of gathering, of compressing all faculties into one vessel before allowing them to manifest. The adept who works with this gate learns to enter stillness, to bind multiplicity, and in doing so gains mastery over the scattering of consciousness that otherwise dominates ordinary life. He learns to sense the pressure of the infinite within the finite, and to make his own being a vessel, however fragile, for the uncontainable light. He learns, in short, to live in the tension of unity and multiplicity, and to taste in himself the primordial ha-Kelim, the bound lights that mark the first attempt of the infinite to dwell within vessels. When the sages of the Ari sought to give a name to this first stage of bound light, they turned not to a philosophical abstraction but to the living Torah, for the secret of ha-Kelim is hidden in the story of Jacob, who labored for Laban and by divine cunning increased his flock through the birth of speckled, spotted, and banded sheep, and it is in that word ha-Kelim, describing the markings on the animal's limbs, that the primordial stage of emanation receives its title, for the sheep marked with bands are a reflection of the lights bound together. In essence, one vessel, indistinguishable yet carrying the potential for differentiation, and just as Jacob's flocks increased through these banded sheep, so too the multitude of worlds is destined to unfold from the binding of lights in ha-Kelim. This Torah allusion teaches that ha-Kelim is not a dry metaphysical doctrine, but a living current that runs through history, showing how the play of concealment and manifestation, of unity and multiplicity, is mirrored in the lives of the patriarchs. For Jacob's labor is the archetype of the human soul's labor in bringing forth abundance through the discipline of restraint. The ha-Kelim sheep are the cosmic prefiguration of the lights bound in one vessel, pregnant with all future unfolding. To meditate on this mystery, the adept may take the image of the banded sheep as a symbol of his own inner faculties, each limb of the body marked with invisible bands, each sense tied, each faculty restrained, and in this way he can feel his own body as the vessel of ha-Kelim, the place where all multiplicity is bound together before release. The practice is to visualize the limbs wrapped with bands of light, luminous cords that tie the powers of thought, emotion, the desire into unity, and to sit in stillness until the sensation of restraint becomes real, until one feels oneself as the living image of ha-Kelim, bound and unified, containing within the seed of differentiation yet not yet unfolded. This meditation is deepened by returning to breath, for breath itself is the most immediate expression of ha-Kelim, a single vessel that carries many qualities, life, spirit, word, and soul, all compressed into one stream, and so the adept may breathe consciously, holding the awareness that each inhalation contains all 10 Sefirot together, bound and inseparable. Each exhalation compresses them further into unity, not yet allowing them to differentiate into distinct powers. In this way, the ordinary act of breathing becomes a reenactment of the ha-Kelim state, for it is the gathering of multiplicity into unity, the restraint of expansion, the knotting of faculties into one. With time, the meditator discovers that his thoughts, which ordinarily scatter into myriad directions, can be gathered like sheep into one fold, tied together like bands upon the limbs, and this gathering is itself the imitation of ha-Kelim, the soul, learning to hold many lights within one vessel. Ritualizing this awareness, one may begin prayer by silently envisioning all the letters of the alphabet, the building blocks of all words and all worlds, bound together in a single radiant point before any utterance is spoken, for just as in ha-Kelim the lights were bound before they could flow into expression, so too in prayer all words must first be bound in the heart before they can be uttered by the mouth. The symbolism of Jacob's sheep also points toward the dynamic of increase, for it was through the ha-Kelim that Jacob's wealth multiplied, and so too through the stage of ha-Kelim that the multitude of worlds will eventually unfold, teaching that restraint and compression are the very source of abundance. The adept therefore learns that to bind his faculties is not to diminish them but to prepare them for increase, for by gathering all powers into unity he creates the potential for their later differentiation into manifold blessings. In practice this may be expressed through the discipline of silence, where the seeker withholds speech not as a negation but as a gathering of all possible words into a single vessel, storing them as Jacob stored the strength of his flocks, and when he finally speaks, his words are multiplied in meaning, bearing within them the depth of unity from which they emerged. Similarly, the discipline of fasting or of holding back from indulgence can be practiced as a form of ha-Kelim, where all appetites are bound into one vessel, restrained for a time in order that they may later flow forth with greater sanctity and abundance. Thus the practice of ha-Kelim becomes not only a meditation, but a way of life, a training in the art of binding and restraining so that the unfolding of multiplicity may be sanctified. At a deeper level, the ha-Kelim meditation also touches upon the mystery of Shevirat, for when one contemplates the lights bound into a single vessel, one senses the inevitability of strain and rupture, and the adept is invited to taste in himself this edge of breaking, the place where the vessel can hardly contain the light. This is not to court destruction, but to awaken compassion for the fragility of all vessels, to realize that the pressure of the infinite within the finite always brings the risk of rupture, and that the work of the soul is to hold gently, to restrain without shattering, to sustain tension without collapse. By cultivating awareness of this fragility, the adept trains himself for the later work of tikkun, the repair vessels, for only one who has felt in himself the strain of ha-Kelim can understand the meaning of brokenness and the necessity of restoration. The ha-Kelim stage thus becomes a meditation not only on unity and restraint, but on the very fragility of existence, the impossibility of holding infinite light within finite forms, and the compassion that arises from knowing that breaking is inevitable, and that repair is the destiny of all. Practically, one may ritualize this awareness through the lighting of a single candle in meditation, contemplating the flame as many lights bound into one vessel of wax and wick, and watching how the flame trembles, always on the edge of consuming its vessel, always at risk of extinguishing itself. Noticing this trembling, the meditator sees the ha-Kelim, the bound lights pressing against the limits of their container. He may meditate until he feels himself as that vessel, his own body trembling under the pressure of bound multiplicity, and then he may extinguish the flame, symbolizing the inevitability of breaking, only to relight it again, symbolizing the mercy of restoration. In this way, the simple act of candle meditation becomes a ritual enactment of ha-Kelim, the gathering of lights, the trembling of vessels, the breaking and the renewal. Through such practices the adept internalizes the cosmic drama, making his own heart a mirror of the first stage of emanation, training himself to live in awareness of the bound lights, the restraint of faculties, the inevitability of breaking, and the hope of repair. Then let us proceed deeper into the current. For having traced the Torah root of the word ha-Kelim, and its image in the sheep of Jacob, we may now turn more closely to the inner nature of the Sefirot themselves, as they are bound in this first vessel. For though we speak of them as 10, in ha-Kelim they cannot be distinguished one from another, for there is but a single vessel, and all 10 dwell together within it, compressed and inseparable, like colors hidden within pure light, like notes still unstruck within the silence of an instrument, like words yet unspoken but already vibrating in the heart of thought. This condition of inseparability is not the same as the pure undifferentiated light of Ein Sof, which is prior to all emanation, and knows no form at all, nor is it the state of Atzilut, in which each Sephirah has its own vessel and function in balanced harmony. Rather, ha-Kelim is the liminal place in between, where form has been traced but not yet expressed, where multiplicity has been conceived but not yet born, and so all 10 dwell together in one container. Potential compressed into actuality, different still bound in unity. To contemplate this is to touch the mystery of simultaneity, for in ha-Kelim every Sephirah is present, but no Sephirah stands apart, and so the mind that meditates upon it must learn to hold contradiction. The awareness of 10 and the awareness of one, the sense of multiplicity, and the sense of undivided unity. The practice that arises from this contemplation is subtle and demanding, for it requires that the adept envision all 10 Sefirot within himself not as separate powers, but as one knot of light, each present yet indistinguishable from the other, and this may be done by first recalling the qualities of each Sephirah, Keter as wool, Akma as wisdom, Bina as understanding, Est as kindness, Shevirat as discipline, Tiferet as beauty, Ni as endurance, Hod as splendor, Yesod as foundation, Malkut as receptivity. Then withdrawing from their distinctions, gathering them all into a single point of luminous awareness, as though each were a thread woven into a single cord. In breathing meditation, one may dedicate each inhalation to the inward gathering of one of the Sefirot, until after 10 breaths all have been collected, and then with the exhalation compress them into a single radiance at the heart where all distinctions vanish, leaving only the awareness of multiplicity bound into unity. To sit with this awareness is to dwell in the state of ha-Kelim, to taste the unity of 10 within one, to hold the tension of undifferentiated difference. In so doing, to imitate the first vessel that held the lights of emanation. This exercise not only mirrors the cosmic state, but also heals the fragmentation of the self, for ordinarily the faculties of the soul are scattered, the will pulling in one direction, wisdom in another, kindness opposing strength, beauty lost in conflict, endurance and splendor unbalanced, foundation unstable, sovereignty untethered, and so the human being lives in a state of dispersion. But by practicing the meditation of ha-Kelim, one gathers all these faculties into a single vessel, making sure to bind them into harmony before they unfold into their proper functions, and thus one experiences inwardly what the cosmos experienced at its beginning, the binding of multiplicity into one vel. This practice trains the soul in unification, teaching that before there can be balance there must be binding, before there can be harmony there must be compression, before there can be expression there must be restraint, and this discipline becomes the foundation for all later work in tikkun. Yet the adept must also be aware that just as in the cosmic ha-Kelim the pressure of 10 lights in one vessel foretold the inevitability of breaking, so too in the soul the binding of faculties can only be sustained for a time before differentiation must occur, and so the practice is not to abolish multiplicity forever, but to experience its unity at the root, to taste the undifferentiated origin before unfolding into diversity, to feel in oneself primordial pressure and to learn compassion for the fragility of vessels. For this reason, when practicing the ha-Kelim meditation, it is wise to conclude not with the permanent compression of faculties, but with a gentle release, allowing the 10 Sefirot to flow outward once more into their distinct qualities, but now tempered by the memory of their unity, just as a musician may first silence the strings to hear their potential harmony before playing them in order, so that the music carries within it the remembrance of silence. In this way, the ha-Kelim practice teaches not only binding but the art of release, the balance between compression and expansion, unity and multiplicity, silence and speech. In ritual enactment, this dynamic may be symbolized by taking 10 small candles and first arranging them tightly together so that their flames appear as one cluster of light, meditating on their unity, and then slowly separating them until each stands apart, still shining but now as distinct radiances, each contributing to the whole, yet each itself. In this simple gesture, the adept replays the drama of ha-Kelim, first bound, and then differentiated, first compressed, and then unfolded, first unity, and then multiplicity, and in this enactment he internalizes the mystery that underlies creation itself. By performing such practices regularly, the seeker aligns his own microcosm with the macrocosmic stages of emanation, learning to live in awareness of the bound lights, to carry within his differentiation the remembrance of unity, and to sense in every act the pressure of the infinite within the finite, the fragility of vessels, and the hope of their repair. Then let us carry the thread forward, for the ha-Kelim cannot be understood without recognizing how it prefigures the world of Tohu, the world of chaos, in which the Sefirot emerge as separate lights with their own vessels but fail to coexist, shattering under the intensity of their own strength. Yet that catastrophe of Shevirat ha-Kelim is already implicit in the bound lights of ha-Kelim, for when 10 infinite radiances are pressed into one vessel the strain is unbearable, and though at this stage the vessel has not yet shattered, the potential for shattering is already present, hovering like a shadow over the still bound light, a prophecy of the rupture that will come when the lights demand full differentiation. In the teaching of the Ari, this sequence is essential, for ha-Kelim is the hidden cause of tohu. The lights bound in one vessel can only remain so for a time, and their natural expansion leads them to burst forth into multiplicity. Yet because the vessels of tohu are too rigid and lack interinclusion, they cannot bear the intensity and collapse, scattering sparks into the abyss. Thus the contemplative who meditates on ha-Kelim must also meditate on the inevitability of Shevirat, sensing within himself that any attempt to compress multiplicity into unity carries within it the seed of rupture, and therefore the practice of ha-Kelim is not simply the cultivation of inward binding, but also the training of the soul to endure the trembling edge of breaking, to feel the strain of holding too much, to dwell in the paradox of a vessel that contains more than it can sustain. In practical meditation, this may be enacted by visualizing the 10 Sefirot as bound into one radiant knot of light at the heart, as before, and then slowly intensifying the brightness of that knot until the meditator feels the vessel of his own being tremble, as if it might burst from the pressure of light, holding that tension until the sensation of breaking arises, and then letting go into silence, surrendering to the inevitability of Shevirat, acknowledging that no vessel can contain the infinite without fracture. This surrender is not despair but compassion, for it teaches the soul to accept fragility, to embrace the brokenness inherent in existence, to know that all vessels, no matter how strong, will eventually shatter under the pressure of divine light, and that this breaking is not the end but the prelude to tikkun, to repair and restoration. In ritual practice, this can be symbolized by taking a single clay vessel, filling it with water as a symbol of bound light, and then gently cracking it with one's hands, watching the water spill, meditating on the breaking of vessels, and then gathering the fragments and placing them together again. Not as a perfect restoration, but as a symbol of compassion and healing. By enacting this ritual, the adept internalizes the cosmic drama, teaching himself that breaking and repair are not failures, but the rhythm of creation itself, that ha-Kelim flows into tohu, tohu into Shevirat, and Shevirat into tikkun. To live with the awareness of ha-Kelim is thus to live with a double vision. On the one hand, the unity of bound lights, the gathering of multiplicity into a single vessel, the discipline of restraint and silence, the power of unification. On the other hand, the inevitability of rupture, the trembling of vessels, the compassion for fragility, the preparation for repair. The adept who practices this awareness learns to see his own life in this rhythm. Times of binding, when all faculties are compressed into unity, times of breaking when the vessel can no longer contain the pressure, and times of repair when the fragments are gathered into a new harmony. In this way, the meditation on ha-Kelim becomes not only a cosmic contemplation, but a guide for living, teaching that unity is precious but fragile, that breaking is painful but necessary, that repair is slow but redemptive, and that through all of it the infinite light continues to shine. Thus ha-Kelim becomes a mirror for the soul, the binding of inner powers, the trembling before breaking, the surrender to rupture, the compassion that follows. And when one contemplates this deeply, one begins to sense that the path of spiritual practice is not to avoid breaking but to embrace it, not to cling forever to the unity of ha-Kelim but to allow it to unfold into tohu, to accept the Shevirat, and to labor for the tikkun. For the true purpose of ha-Kelim is not to remain forever bound but to set the stage for the great drama of creation, to teach the soul the discipline of binding and the compassion of breaking, so that when the work of repair comes, one may participate fully, gathering sparks, mending vessels, hastening redemption. Then let us move further, for the wisdom of ha-Kelim is not meant to remain in lofty abstraction, but to be woven into the fabric of daily life, so that the seeker may embody the cosmic rhythm in the microcosm of his own soul. For just as the lights were bound into one vessel, trembled with intensity, and pressed toward breaking, so too within the human being there are times when the inner faculties must be gathered, compressed, and held together before they can be released into differentiated action, and this cycle may be cultivated through deliberate daily practice. The adept begins each day with a meditation of binding, gathering all the scattered powers of his mind and heart into a single vessel of awareness. Before speech, before action, before dispersal into the multiplicity of worldly tasks, he sits in silence and collects his faculties, remembering that within him are the 10 Sefirot, each with its own quality, yet all can be compressed into one radiant knot. This may be done through breathwork, 10 inhalations, each dedicated to the inward gathering of a Sefirot, followed by one long exhalation in which all are compressed into a single flame in the heart, an act of inner ha-yiḥudim that sets the tone of the day. As the day unfolds, the adept practices the trembling of vessels, consciously entering moments when the bound energies strain against their containment, when the will desires expression, when wisdom longs to speak, when kindness and strength wrestle for release. At these moments he does not suppress, but notices, holding the tension as long as possible without spilling, tasting within himself the inevitability of rupture. He allows the body to feel the trembling, the slight unease of holding too much, the pressure of light within limited form, and he breathes into that pressure, remembering that this is the rhythm of creation itself. Compression before release, trembling before breaking. And when the moment of release comes, when the vessel can no longer hold, he lets go with mindfulness, allowing the light to flow outward into words, deeds, and actions, with the remembrance of unity still imprinted upon it. In this way, every action of the day carries within it the hidden trace of ha-Kelim, for though the faculties have unfolded into multiplicity, they still echo the silence of their unity. At day's end, the adept practices the ritual of release and compassion, recalling that every vessel, even the vessel of his own day, will break, that no binding can last forever, that every effort to hold unity must eventually surrender to fragmentation. He may light 10 candles and gather them close until their flames appear as one, meditate on their unity, then slowly separate them until each shines alone, acknowledging the unfolding into multiplicity. At times, he may even extinguish one or two, enacting the fragility of vessels, and then relight them, symbolizing tikkun, the restoration that follows Shevirat. By closing the day with such ritual gestures, he teaches his soul that breaking is not failure but rhythm, that repair is always possible, that compassion is born of fragility. On a psychological level, this daily cycle of binding, trembling, and release mirrors the inner life of the human being, for each person carries within himself conflicting drives, desires, thoughts, and emotions, which if left scattered create confusion, and if pressed too harshly into unity create rupture. To practice ha-Kelim is to learn the art of gathering without annihilation, of compressing without crushing, of holding without clinging, of releasing without despair. When the adept gathers his faculties in the morning, he experiences his inner powers as one. When he allows them to strain against containment during the day, he acknowledges their intensity and their inevitability. When he releases them with mindfulness, he prevents the unconscious shattering that comes from suppression. When he enacts rituals of compassion in the evening, he teaches himself to embrace brokenness and to live with hope of repair. In this way, the cosmic drama of ha-Kelim becomes the daily rhythm of the soul, guiding the practitioner not only in lofty meditation but in ordinary life, shaping his way of speaking, acting, loving, and healing. Thus, ha-Kelim is not merely a stage in the history of the cosmos, but a living technique for the spiritual seeker, a discipline of gathering and releasing, a meditation on the unity of difference, a ritual of compassion for broken vessels. And by practicing it daily, the adept prepares himself for the deeper mysteries that follow, for Tohu, for Shevirat, for Tikkun, each of which unfolds from the first bound lights. In learning to live the rhythm of ha-Kelim, he aligns himself with the primordial order, harmonizes his microcosm with the macrocosm, and makes of his life a vessel that can both tremble and endure, both break and be repaired, both hold the infinite and surrender to its overflow. Then let us weave the strands of Torah and Zohar into the mystery of ha-Kelim, for nothing in Lurianic Kabbalah stands apart from Scripture, and the Ari himself clothed his teachings in the garments of verses, hints, and midrashic allusions, that the adept might see in the Torah not merely stories of the past, but archetypes of cosmic process. The very name ha-Kelim is drawn from the tale of Jacob and the flocks, when he arranged rods before the sheep so that they would bring forth young that were ha-Kelim, nikudim, and berudim, bound, speckled, and spotted. Genesis chapter 30 verses 27 to 43. The sages puzzled over why such details of animal husbandry should be recorded in the Torah, but the Ari taught that these three terms are secret names for the primordial stages of emanation: ha-Kelim, the bound lights in one vessel; nikudim, the points of light in separate vessels; and berudim, the modeled forms of harmony that emerge after the repair of shattering. In this way, the patriarch Jacob is revealed not merely as a shepherd, but as a mystic who, in the earthly act of breeding sheep, was aligning his soul with the cosmic drama, participating in the binding and release of lights. To meditate on Jacob's rods is to contemplate the lines of emanation that draw down light into the vessels, to see in the speckled offspring the mystery of multiplicity born of unity, and to realize that every detail of the Torah contains within it the code of creation. Another Torah correspondence is the binding of Isaac, the Akedah, Genesis 22, whose very name echoes ha-Kelim. For in that story, Abraham binds his son upon the altar, restraining the outflow of his paternal love, compressing his emotion into silence, holding back the hand that would strike and the heart that would break, until the angel of ha-Yiḥudim intervenes. This binding is a human reflection of the cosmic binding. Just as the lights were bound into one vessel, so Isaac was bound upon the altar. Just as the pressure of ha-Kelim foretold a rupture, so the Akedah foretold the death that was narrowly averted. Just as the vessel trembles under the strain, so Abraham trembled under the weight of obedience. The adept who contemplates ha-Kelim in the light of the Akedah learns that spiritual life requires binding of the faculties, restraint of the heart, discipline of the hand, not as a denial of life but as a preparation for its unfolding, that the true sacrifice is not in death but in the gathering of multiplicity into unity. Thus the Akedah becomes a living parable for ha-Kelim, the binding of difference into one vessel, the trembling before rupture, the intervention of mercy, the release into life. The Zohar, too, provides veiled hints of ha-Kelim, for when it speaks of lights that shine without separation, of 10 that are one, of the knot that binds the Sefirot together, it gestures toward that first vessel in which all were contained. The Pritzker edition preserves many such passages, often cryptic, describing the Kesherim, bindings, of the Sefirot. The state of 10 that are one and one that is 10, which the Ari later systematized into the doctrine of ha-Kelim. The contemplative who reads the Zohar with this in mind begins to see that ha-Kelim is not an invention, but a revelation, hidden already in the ancient Aramaic mystical discourse, waiting for the Ari to unveil its full structure. By attuning himself to these correspondences, the adept deepens his practice, realizing that ha-Kelim is not merely a cosmological stage, but a Torah-anchored archetype, woven into the stories of patriarchs and the visions of mystics encoded in the speckled sheep and the bound sun, waiting to be unlocked through meditation. The practical fruit of this awareness is a new dimension of ritual and contemplation. When reading the Torah portions that speak of Jacob's flocks or the binding of Isaac, the adept does not see only history but also cosmology, not only narrative but also technique. As he reads of Jacob peeling rods, he imagines the drawing down of light into vessels. As he reads of Isaac bound upon the altar, he contemplates the binding of his own faculties. As he studies the Zoharic images of unity and knotting, he meditates on the compression of multiplicity into one. Thus scripture itself becomes a meditation manual, a map of ha-Kelim hidden in plain sight, accessible to those who know the secret names. And by practicing this alignment, the adept not only contemplates ha-Kelim in abstract, but enacts it in the rhythm of Torah study, binding his learning, his breath, his heart, and his actions into one bell before allowing them to unfold. Then let us pass now into the innermost chamber of practice, where ha-Kelim is not only contemplated as a cosmological stage nor read in the garments of Torah allegory, but actively entered through the discipline of ha-Kelim. Unifications of divine names, visualizations of light and vessel, compressions of multiplicity into unity performed not in thought alone but in the very breath, voice, and intention of the adept. For just as in ha-Kelim the 10 Sefirot are present but indistinguishable, so too in Yichud the practitioner takes many holy names, many permutations of the ineffable, and compresses them into one knot of radiance, holding them together until the mind trembles under the weight of unity, mirroring the trembling of the first vessel. The Ari taught that all permutations of the Tetragrammaton, ha-Yiḥudim spelled out in the 4 ways known as Ab, 72, Sag, 63, Ma, 45, and Ben, 52, can be visualized together, each unfolding in its letters and numbers, yet all gathered into a single point of light. Ordinarily, one contemplates them separately, each expressing a distinct world or aspect of divine manifestation. But in the Yichud of ha-Kelim, the adept imagines them all collapsing inward, as if 4 vast rivers of light converge into one. Spring, no longer distinct but bound, their differences dissolved in the singularity of the vessel. The practice begins by writing or envisioning each permutation in its fullness: Aleph Laden ha-Yiḥudim for Ab, Yod Laden ha-Yiḥudim for Sag, Hef filled for Ma. and Vav filled for Ben, reciting them slowly with breath and kavana, and then gathering them all into one loop. As Yod, the point of inception in which all multiplicity is compressed. To sustain this visualization is to enter the very state of ha-Kelim, where all lights exist but none can yet be distinguished, where the four spellings are one, where Ab, Sag, Ma, and Ben are bound in a single vessel. Another technique is to take the divine name Ehi, associated with Keter, and to repeat it with inward intention until its letters dissolve into a single Aleph, symbol of pure unity. One may do the same with the name Adonai, compressing its four letters into a single Dalet, or with Ehia Asher Ehia, contracting it back into Ehia, and then into the silent Aleph. In each case, the multiplicity of letters and syllables is compressed into one, mirroring the binding of Sefirot in ha-Kelim. This practice can be accompanied by breath, inhaling on each letter, exhaling on the whole word, and then drawing the entire word into a single point of silent awareness, holding it as long as possible before letting it expand again. In this way, the adept trains himself in the rhythm of compression and release, binding names as the cosmos-bound lights. More advanced practitioners may attempt the yichud of the 72 triplets, Shem ha-Mefarash, which are usually meditated upon one by one, but in the ha-Kelim practice are all gathered together into one radiant scroll of fire. Imagine not as 72 separate flames but as one conflagration in which all distinctions are swallowed. To do this is to test the vessel of the mind, for it strains to hold so many lights at once, and in the trembling of that strain the adept touches the edge of Shevirat, feeling the pressure that the first vessel endured, sensing the inevitability of rupture. By practicing this regularly, the soul becomes attuned not only to the sweetness of unity but also to the compassion born of fragility, learning to bear multiplicity bound without rushing to differentiation, training the heart in patience, silence, and restraint. The purpose of these ha-Kelim is not only mystical ecstasy but also ethical transformation, for the one who binds names learns to bind his own impulses, to compress his scattered desires into a single will directed toward the infinite, to restrain himself from dispersion into endless distractions. He becomes, in his own way, a vessel of ha-Kelim, fragile yet luminous, trembling yet enduring, carrying within himself the imprint of primordial unity. In this way, the yichud of names is not a mere technical exercise but a path of becoming. To compress the divine multiplicity into one is to make oneself an image of ha-Kelim, a microcosm of the bound lights, preparing the soul for the work of repair that will follow when differentiation and breaking arise. Then let us press deeper, for the ha-Kelim is not only a cosmological stage and a practice of ha-Kelim but also the beginning of an inner alchemy, a work of binding the scattered substances of the soul before they are allowed to separate and act. Just as in ha-Kelim the 10 Sefirot are gathered into one vessel, so within the human being the diverse powers of the psyche, desire, thought, imagination, will, emotion, must first be gathered and compressed if they are to be purified and transformed. This is the alchemical conjunctio at its earliest stage, the black pressure of unity before color unfolds, the hidden heat that binds matter before it can be refined into gold. The adept who practices ha-Kelim within himself begins by recognizing that his drives are ordinarily scattered. His aze flows one way, his Shevirat another. His wisdom aims high while his endurance collapses, and so his inner world is like tohu, fragmented and unstable. By taking these forces and gathering them in silence, by compressing them into one knot of intention, he creates within himself a furnace where transformation may occur, where the raw elements of the soul are fused together and to a single substance awaiting refinement. This inner binding is not without strain, for just as the lights in ha-Kelim trembled within their vessel, so the soul trembles when its drives are compressed, and here the adept begins to feel the alchemy of tension, the heat of containment. The alchemists spoke of solve et coagula, to dissolve and to bind, and in ha-Kelim we find the primordial coagulation, the pressure that causes the matter of the soul to sweat, to reveal its hidden essence. By sitting in silence, compressing his faculties through breath and kavana, the practitioner allows his multiplicity to cook in the furnace of unity until a new quality emerges, a subtle awareness of the root from which all drives spring, taste of the unifying desire for the infinite that lies beneath every scattered impulse. This awareness is the beginning of the transformation, the first distillation, for when one sees that all desires, whether for food or knowledge, love or power, are shadows of the one desire for the source, then one has transmuted lead into silver, multiplicity into unity, scattering into return. But the work of ha-Kelim does not end there, for just as the cosmic ha-Kelim leads into ha-Kelim, the world of separated points, so too the inner ha-Kelim inevitably unfolds into differentiation. The adept must allow his bound drives to separate again, to unfold into distinct faculties. But now each carries within it the memory of unity, the fragrance of the furnace. This is the second stage of inner alchemy, differentiation tempered by the memory of unity. It is as though the soul has passed through a crucible and emerged reshaped, its scattered drives no longer chaotic but harmonized, no longer competing blindly but cooperating in the memory of their shared origin. This movement from binding to unfolding mirrors the cosmic movement from ha-Kelim to ha-Kelim, and just as the cosmic ha-Kelim suffered Shevirat because its vessels were too rigid and lacked inter-inclusion, so the human soul too may suffer breaking, if it unfolds into multiplicity without compassion, if its faculties become isolated and inflexible. Thus the inner practice of ha-Kelim trains the adept to carry unity into differentiation, to unfold without breaking, to differentiate without losing the memory of the one. In this way, ha-Kelim is the root of an inner alchemy that prepares the soul for every later stage of work. It teaches restraint before expression, unity before multiplicity, silence before speech, binding before action. It reveals the furnace in which scattered drives may be fused into one essence, and it warns of the trembling edge of rupture, teaching compassion for fragility. By practicing ha-Kelim, the adept becomes an alchemist of his own psyche, learning to transmute chaos into order, lead into silver, multiplicity into unity, fragility into compassion. And when he is ready, he will move into ha-Kelim with greater stability, for he will know the secret of inter-inclusion, that even as the Sefirot unfold into separate points, they must remember their origin in unity, lest they break as they did in Tohu. Thus ha-Kelim is not only the first vessel of creation, but the first crucible of transformation, the black furnace of compression in which the soul begins its great work. Then we enter now the living dimension of ha-Kelim, not as abstract cosmology, nor only as high ritual, but as a discipline woven into the fabric of the soul's daily life, where the binding of the lights becomes a path of psychological transformation, a school of the speech and attention. For ha-Kelim is in essence a discipline of concentration, the compression of the manifold into a single point of focus, a training of the soul in restraint before release, and inward practice whose fruit is not only mystical ascent but mastery of one's own interior life. In the human soul, the 10 Sefirot correspond to faculties of thought and feeling, and in ordinary life these faculties work apart, and in discord memory is drawn in one direction, desire in another, intellect in yet another. To live in ha-Kelim is to learn to gather these faculties in a single vessel, to hold them together in silence before allowing them to unfold. This gathering becomes the root of psychological discipline. One method is the practice of inner concentration, kavanat lev, whereby the adept trains his mind to unify all its movements into one stream of attention. This can be practiced simply in daily life. When reading a sacred text, one focuses not only on the words but also on the movement of breath, holding all distractions in suspension. When walking, one attends wholly to each step, not merely in the external act, but in the inward gathering of attention, feet, breath, heart, and thought bound in one moment. This is an ha-Kelim technique of binding the faculties that teaches the soul to live in a state of concentrated unity rather than in scattered distraction. It is a discipline of attention, a daily crucible where multiplicity is bound before release. A second application is restraint of speech, tzniut dibur, which mirrors the binding of light in ha-Kelim. Speech, being an outward projection of thought and will, is ordinarily scattered and reactive. The discipline of ha-Kelim calls for speech to be bound, restrained, tested before release. The adept practices silence not as mere absence, but as preparation, silence in which the powers of speech are gathered in one vessel, purified by attention, and only released when they serve the highest purpose. This is not withdrawal but refined action, speaking when words bear the fullness of unity, withholding when speech would fracture or scatter the intention. This restraint is a living yichud, a binding of divine potential in the vessel of human tongue, aligning everyday life with the inner discipline of ha-Kelim. A third application is channeling desire, kavanat tava, the deliberate gathering and directing of impulses rather than allowing them to scatter into endless gratification. Desire in the ordinary mind is like light that escapes the vessel. In ha-Kelim, the adept trains desire to be bound until it becomes a single flame that can be offered in service to the divine. This may be practiced by choosing a single intention in prayer, study, or action, and refusing to scatter one's energies in competing aims. For example, before engaging in a study session or ritual, the adept may fix a single kavana, to bind my will to the service of the One, and then direct all attention, emotion, and breath toward sustaining that aim. Desire thus becomes a trained instrument, a bound force that mirrors the compression of lights in ha-Kelim, and thereby becomes capable of sustaining greater tasks of differentiation and repair in later stages. In practical life, the discipline of ha-Kelim can be integrated into a daily pattern. One might begin the day with a moment of silence and concentration, a binding of breath and thought into one point. Before speaking, one might pause to test whether speech will scatter or unify intention. Before acting, one might gather desire and will as if binding them in a vessel, offering them silently as a ha-yiḥudim of service. This discipline turns every moment of life into a microcosm of ha-Kelim, a rehearsal of the cosmic binding. Over time, the adept develops an inner habit of unity, an inner vessel capable of holding multiplicity without rupture, and an ever-deepening capacity for restraint, attention, and compassion. This psychological discipline is also the ground of compassion itself. To bind one's faculties is to learn self-restraint, and from self-restraint arises a capacity to hold others without judgment, to receive differences without scattering in discord. Ha-Kelim trains not only the intellect but the heart, producing a soul capable of holding others in the vessel of compassion. Thus the inner alchemy of ha-Kelim becomes an ethical discipline. To gather oneself is to open to the world without breaking, to unify one's interior life is to meet the multiplicity of creation with tenderness. In this way, ha-Kelim is not an esoteric abstraction, but a lived path of transformation, an inner discipline that shapes thought, speech, desire, and compassion alike.